Libros Schmibros is a podcast exploring the people, books, movies, and ideas that Angelenos care about in a thoughtful way that even New Yorkers can understand. We're coming to you from Libros Schmibros, our nonprofit bilingual lending library in Boyle Heights, on the west coast of the country and the east bank of the mighty Los Angeles River.
It's David Kipen at Libros Schmibros. Today, I'm going to talk with John Logan, the Oscar-winning screenwriter of The Aviator and RKO 281, and in this case, of the new Showtime series, Penny Dreadful, City of Angels. That's right, City of Angels as in Los Angeles, because a lot of it takes place in Belvedere Heights, which is a coded, slightly stylized version of Boyle Heights. I really hope you like it.
Hello, is this John Logan?
Yes, it is.
Oh, hi. What a treat to finally talk with you. I'm David Kipen.
Indeed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I can't Zoom. I've had just the worst Zoom experience. Like the last week, my computer's like, no, you're not connecting to this Zoom, my friend. And it's like, you have like play readings and things. It's like, oh, for God's sake. So anyway, good to talk to you.
Very good to talk to you. I think we've all had enough Zoom to last us a lifetime these days.
Yeah, not me, though. I'm like, the one good thing to come out of all of this is like, you mean I don't need to get in my car and drive for an hour and a half to have a meeting? Okay, I could live with that. I'm finding it, and weirdly, it's, I do a lot of theater work. It's really good for doing readings, because I'm working on a musical now. We've done a bunch of readings, and it's like very helpful just to like hear the whole piece without flying halfway across the world and bringing everyone in at that expense. So there are a few bright spots.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. I'll keep looking harder for my own.
You look a little harder.
Well, let me just, I guess, set the rules of engagement here. I'm sure you get interviewed all the time, so just to recap, my name is David Kipen. I run a nonprofit lending library in Boyle Heights called Libros Schmibros. I'm also a critic at large for the LA Times. And we've been starting to have, so by all means, cut us some slack for any growing pains, these conversations, especially with screenwriters, because I wrote a book years ago called The Schreiber Theory, in which you actually appear.
Which I appreciate.
Well, I'm happy to hear it. And so you being a screenwriter, why don't you, in the theater of listeners' minds, set the scene for us? If not in your car, if not on a soundstage, where have we found you?
You have found me at my home, and where I've been safely locked down for the last 2 months. I'm in my office where I always work. I usually get up very, very early to work, usually by 4.
Yeah.
So I'm well into my day by now. Oh, it's no great miracle because I also go to bed at 8. So believe me, it's not like I'm a Superman. So I've been up and at it, working away, and I'm in the midst of doing all the posts for Penny Dreadful. So it's all by remote. So that entails hundreds and hundreds of sort of emails and links to every music cue and special effects cue and things. So I've been sorting through that gradually this morning.
Yikes. Well, I feel a little less guilty about interrupting you now.
No, don't. I'm happy to not be looking at another music cue.
So in this office, in this house, as a charter member and I think supporter of the Library of America, which I know you are, would I be mistaken in assuming there might be at least one book in the same room with you?
Yes, I am. I am surrounded by books. I have a bookshelf filled with the yet to be read books.
Oh.
Because I'm sort of a compulsive, reader of book reviews. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting. I don't know much about the life of Grant Wood. I should get that book. And just and like, what? I haven't read that Nero Wolfe novel. Let's get that for a trip sometime. So I'm surrounded with books, and mostly, if you could see it, and this is why it's a shame we can't Zoom, piles and piles of research, because I do a lot of historical material.
Yeah.
Every project is just mounds and mounds and mounds of work, and you can only do so much work online. I'm of a generation that needs a paper and a pen to actually take notes. So, currently, I'm working on a movie about Michael Jackson, so I have just stacks and stacks of books and notes and interview notes and things, so that are taking over one entire part of the office.
Well, how nice for you that on a project like Penny Dreadful, you didn't have to worry about research. You could just sort of sit back and make it up.
Yeah, I could just make it all up. No, that was a it's like, when people ask me, well, like, what's the most research you've done for anything? I'm like, well, I wrote a play about Mark Roscoe that took about a year of research.
I well know it and appreciate it.
Right, and then when I wrote The Aviator, that was 4 years of research, and Penny Dreadful, the new one, not the old one, has been years of in the making and researching, because I love Los Angeles, love the history, and it's not onerous, it's pleasurable. But to me, when you're dealing with any historical character or epoch, the devil's in the details, and you might turn one page that will unlock something. It's a bit the Robert Caro, idea, which is you kind of have to read everything because doors will be open to things you didn't expect, and you might think, well, that's an interesting character or interesting confrontation or interesting moment in the drama. So I'm a great believer in reading and noting everything.
Well, since Libros Schmibros is in Boyle Heights, and I and a lot of us are longstanding obsessives with Los Angeles, I'm curious, for example, what page did you turn as you were working on Penny Dreadful that had that kind of epiphany for you, that unlocked some of the story that you were hoping to tell in your research?
It was, I started sort of researching the freeways, particularly Arroyo Seco, which is our first freeway, as you know, and in Boyle Heights, you know it very well. And I was looking at a 1937, year before our show is set, city council plan for, hey, if we start building freeways, here's where we'll build them. And they had various plans of various freeway routes lined out, and that map included things like the Beverly Hills Freeway, the Pacific Coast Freeway, and I was just stunned looking at those lines and knowing where the freeways existed. And then, we just researched why the freeways were built, when they were built, and what did that do to the communities around them. And, the stunning fact is that in 1937, Los Angeles would have had some very sensible freeway lanes everywhere. But the only 100% of the ones that were built were East LA, and South the city, and in the Latino and African-American neighborhoods, and that's why we don't have North Main Street anymore, and that's why we don't have Sonora Town or the Chavez Ravine in a way, or Sugar Hill, or Bunker Hill the way it was, because that's where the freeways were built. So a good example of turning a page is just looking at those studies of proposed freeways and then looking at what exists now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly comes across in the show, which I regret to say I've only seen 6 episodes of, but I think that's 2 more episodes than most people. And it sounds like the ink is still wet on the last episode or 2 even now.
Right.
So I will sit on the edge of my chair along with the rest of America for that. How do you think that this story of Los Angeles? Well, let me backtrack a little bit. You're a Californian of sorts. Were you not born in San Diego?
I was born in San Diego, and I lived in Chula Vista, in San Pedro, in Hollywood Hills for a while. And so I've lived on and off in California periodically. But my father's a naval architect, so we sort of moved from port city to port city growing up. So I lived in Mississippi. I lived in New Jersey a lot. I live in various places, but California is always where we came back to, and it's certainly my roots and my native soil. And
since, looking over your filmography, your interest in myths and mythology and myth-making does kind of jump out at a person. How was that nurtured growing up? Were you like a captive of Edith Hamilton or comic books?
No, it was Shakespeare. It was watching Olivier's Hamlet when I was 8, which my dad made me do, and just falling in love with Shakespeare and reading those plays way too young. And trying to understand them and watching all the movies that I could, particularly the 3 Olivier movies, which were the most accessible, and just falling in love with the power and poetry and majesty of what Shakespeare was doing. And, any dramatist will tell you that, there's two kinds of dramatists. There's the Chekhov dramatist and there's the Shakespeare dramatist. And the Chekhov dramatist can, break your heart with a tiny little gesture. A guitar string snaps and the world ends. And that's a beautiful, delicate way of writing. And it's not what I do, and it's not what I can do. And I'm in awe of those who do it so successfully. And then there's the Shakespearean model, which makes a grand, sweeping, passionate, thunderous gesture, and isn't afraid to sort of bat for the stars with real grandiosity. And that's always what I've been drawn to, probably because Shakespeare and musical theater was what I fell in love with first. So that's sort of where my attraction to those larger-than-life characters and sort of operatic scope and no fear of melodrama that I think informs probably most of my work.
Well, you talk about adaptations and feeling a certain responsibility to the source material. How must you have felt when you sat down to adapt Coriolanus?
Well, a fair piece, needless to say. But thankfully, Coriolanus is one of Shakespeare's least beloved plays. It's not like you're approaching the monolith that is Hamlet. You're approaching the sort of scuzzy little child that some people love, but most people don't. So Ray Fiennes and I just said, look, let's just do this movie, and purists will be offended, as well they should be, and but we'll get a chance to dive in and collaborate with Shakespeare. Honestly, doing Coriolanus is a lot less intimidating than doing Sweeney Todd. When you're sitting across from Stephen Sondheim and saying, well, now here's your masterwork score, and we have to cut half of it. But adaptations are tricky things, because you're right to say they're a complete collaboration with the author, of the original text. And whether that's, Brian Selznick on Hugo, or even Ian Fleming on the Bond films, you always have that other writer over your shoulder, and I believe in a brotherhood of writers. I believe in respecting their work, as much as possible. And I would like to think Blood and Thunder William Shakespeare would see our version of Coriolanus and say, okay, yeah, they had some fun with this. It's violent, it's exciting. It doesn't avoid the emotion of the piece. Could have been 3 hours longer, but otherwise okay.
Do you have, now, you and I only ever corresponded because I was interviewing Scott Berg when his biography of Woodrow Wilson came out, and we got to talking about Maxwell Perkins, who is the subject of Berg's first biography. And he, I gather, swam into your ken because you fell in love with that book, with his biography of Maxwell Perkins, and the relationship between him and Thomas Wolfe, which became your movie Genius, or should I, well, this opens up a whole kettle of worms, but is it your movie Genius or Michael Grandage's movie Genius? Or
well, it's our movie. Any writer is going to deny the authorial credit to a director. And with all respect, I've worked with great directors, and that was my goal for my very first movie is to work with directors, because that would always be my joy in the theater. And the closest collaboration that a writer ever has is with a director, whether it's on stage or TV or film. And so, I always feel the best work I do is when I'm working with collaborators who respect what I do and I respect what they do. So to me, it's always our film. Which might be a little audacious, but that's what I think.
Well, having written a whole book very skeptical about the auteur theory, as I did, I can't help feeling a little vindicated to look at the television landscape nowadays and see how the showrunner has basically, we talk about him the way we would once have talked about auteurs in film. What's it like making television right now? Do you feel like your job is the same as it always was as a writer? Are you an auteur, God forbid, as a showrunner of Penny Dreadful?
It's difficult to say. I mean, the vision is mine. Mm-hmm. I created it. You love it or hate it, it's the show I want to make, and every frame is the frame I want it to be, and every word is the word I want it to be. Which, on one hand, is a titanic amount of power, but it's also an awesome responsibility to the collaborators you're working with. And my friend Catherine Bigelow, when I was first starting out on this, said to me, you let your thoroughbreds run. Meaning, if you're working with great artists, let them go. You're not the jockey, they are, And so I liken it to being, I'm the admiral, but I'm not the captain of the ship, and I'm happy to be the admiral, but at the end of the day, as President Truman said, the buck truly stops with me. Yeah. And love it or hate it, it's the show that I always imagined in my head.
What's it like working with episode directors who have grown up thinking of themselves as auteurs and finding themselves serving somebody else's vision for a change?
Well, it's being very comfortable on Penny Dreadful, because I think they go in with a certain expectation of who I am and what I've done with this show, and we always have big conversations about it, about how we finesse being on the set, for example, and what I do and what I don't do, and what I'm comfortable with, what I'm not comfortable with. And it's, for the most part, it's been fine. I've overreached, and I've had to pull back, which is correct, and the other way as well. So it's an interesting little pas de deux that you do with a series director. Because of my experience in film, on stage, where I cut my teeth with Oliver Stone and Ridley Scott and Michael Mann and Marty Scorsese, with Michael Grandage, with Bob Falls, with Alex Timbers, my respect for directors is so extreme that, I am always willing to let a director try anything they want, explore, tease it out, because I'm not a director. It's not a gift I have. I have no interest in doing that job. If you said to me, you and me are sitting across the table, put a camera and film it, I wouldn't know where to start. So, I know what I do, and more importantly, I know what I don't do.
Got it. Well, let's talk a little bit more about Boyle Heights, which in Penny Dreadful we know as Belvedere Heights. I mean, just superficially, how was that decision taken?
It's, Belvedere Heights is sort of a conglomeration of a number of neighborhoods that were sort of destroyed when the Arroyo Seco was built. It's not an actual neighborhood. There was a neighborhood called Belvedere then, and a number of other ones. There was what we refer to as Sonora Town, which was also Sonora Town at the time, which was closer to the city, which is, sort of where if you follow the sort of Arroyo Seco from the music center on, you'd be running into that. And, of course, Boyle Heights as well. So we wanted to create a fictional, I wanted to create a fictional community because I wanted to be able to do with it as I will, as was appropriate to what the story was. And, at its heart, this is a story about the building of a freeway. So I had to create the dynamics that would allow the characters to do what I felt was necessary without being too tied to specific streets in specific neighborhoods.
Well, so much of Los Angeles' mythology is every bit as much about the myth of the freeway as it is about mythic characters. And you're not the first filmmaker to deal with this. I hope I can call you a filmmaker.
You certainly can.
And so, how did you feel as if what you were working on was entering into the tradition of movies like L.A. Confidential, which begins with the opening of a freeway, and certainly Chinatown before that. How does Penny Dreadful make its way into the canon of L.A. filmmaking? Well, I think that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it because no one asked that question. You're talking about the wrong interviewers. I think it's totally. I think it's the right. I think it's the right question to ask. Because, when most people think of the 30s in L.A., they think of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. They think of Hollywood. And this is not a story about Hollywood. It's a story about downtown and about dispossessed and marginalized communities. It's not a celebration of Ruby Keeler. It was always intended to be not anti-Hollywood, but not to deal with that story in any way at all, because that's not the story we wanted to tell. And, and the motivation for writing it had to do with the response to the seismic changes in the world around us in the last 4 years, and the parallels between then and now, which I think are so profound and sort of shockingly and sadly becoming more profound as every day passes right now. But, we were aware there is a mythology, a cinematic mythology already built around Los Angeles. It's mostly noir,
you know. And so what we did, you know, working with the directors and the DPs, was go anti-noir. You know, no canted angles, no dark, wet alleys. This is about sun-baked Los Angeles, you know, and I watched everything, you know, and I think that the triptych for me that were most useful in terms of the tone of the show was Chinatown. So I think John Alonzo and Polanski captured something very real about Los Angeles without falling into noir tropes. To Live and Die in L.A., which I think captures something sort of harsh and crotochrome and violent about the underbelly of the city, and really Heat and Collateral. You know, the way Michael Mann views Los Angeles as a complete organism, and the subsets or tribes that he chooses to deal with, in those cases criminal, you know, are related to a larger social context, the way he presents them. So those 3 movies or 4 movies sort of became a real sort of thing that I studied a lot and thought about, both in terms of when do I want to emulate and when do I want to avoid, you know, in terms of making something unique. But because of the specificity of this show, you know, early 1938, about politics, about the freeway, about crime, about, you know, folk Catholicism, you know, it led to very specific avenues of exploration. It has its own DNA that I hope pays honor to filmmakers of the past, but also, you know, tries to do something new and contemporary.
Oh, it absolutely does. And I'm thrilled to hear somebody else mention To Live and Die in L.A., because you know, as pure storytelling, the way that the hero of that movie disappears 20 minutes from the end, and the supporting cast character...
It's Psycho in reverse.
Yes, exactly. Nice to meet a kindred spirit on that one. Now, you're speaking of you know, great L.A. movies past. What about L.A. books that have fed your understanding of and vision for the city?
You know, it's interesting. Obviously, all the standard histories, and particularly the engineering and sort of architecture and design histories of Los Angeles. In terms of sort of tone or sensibility, what I absorbed was Nathaniel West, Chandler, and particularly Dashiell Hammett. Even though obviously he dealt mostly with Northern California, there's something about the sort of subdued honesty of his books without undue metaphors that I found sort of brutally exciting. You know, and if you read a book like Red Harvest, you know, as you know, is a collection of Conrad Lopp's stories sort of cobbled together in The Dane Curse. You know, what you find is a very flawed hero trying to move through a world that's even more flawed than he is, you know. Yeah. And those 2 books were probably weirdly the most influential, you know, although for sheer reading enjoyment, you know, Raymond Chandler, you know, You Can't Beat and The Big Sleep was written exactly in 1938, you know, and Nathaniel West offers, you know, such a poetic and harsh viewpoint of Los Angeles, both in Day of the Locust, you know, even in Miss Lonely Hearts and sort of other his work. Those 3 were the most significant for me in terms of other writers per se.
Yeah, Miss Lonely Hearts. I was just reading the new Michael Connelly novel, and the killer in it is called Shrike, who I think is the editor in Miss Lonely Hearts.
Got to be intentional. You don't hit on that name by mistake.
Well, wow. Now, writing about Boyle Heights, you know, surely you knew you were at risk of getting some grief because it's become a slightly contested place, and who gets to write about it, who doesn't get to write about it. You know, is that something that factored into your thinking? Has there been any sort of blowback since the show came out into daylight?
Well, that's a provocative question, you know, and there's a philosophical answer and there's a practical answer. The practical answer is, you know, once I centered on a Latino detective and his family, I realized I needed help, you know, for authenticity, for texture and details that I could not know. So I was very careful about, you know, my producing partner, Michael Aguilar, 2 of our directors, 2 of the writers, you know, were Latino, were Hispanic, so they could bring that viewpoint to it. And certainly all the actors are very vocal, you know, as well, which I welcome heartily. You know, and I asked, you know, Diego Rivera, who wrote our 5th episode, to pass through all 10 episodes, Just to, like, do an authenticity pass. You know, let me know what's not feeling right, with the understanding that a contemporary, you know, person will not necessarily understand or be able to appreciate the subtlety of 1938 politics or social interaction. So that's the practical answer. The philosophical answer is I absolutely reject the idea of balkanization in the arts. You know, I believe writers need to be able to write and dream and imagine in characters other than themselves and in voices that are not their voices. You know, and I don't want to live in a world where Lin-Manuel can't write George Washington, or George Gershwin can't write Bess, or I can't write Mark Rothko. You know, the idea of cultural appropriation to me is venomous and dangerous. Because I think if you get boxed in creatively as an artist, you're finished. You know, and you have to be able to look beyond your own self to be able to create.
Understood. Now, when you mentioned the other writers in the writers' room with you, that's kind of what is it like? I mean, totally unlike it, or even unlike writing for film, where at least presumably you have a draft you can call your own. What's it like superintending an atelier of other writers rather than it just being you alone in the room?
Well, this is the first time I've ever done it, and I found it incredibly exciting. You know,
did you not even do it for the first couple?
No,
of
we brought
two
other writers in for the last season to write 2 episodes, but I just sort of sat with them. You know, and we talked. This was a proper writing room. I'd written the first 4 episodes, and then we charted out the rest of the season. You know, very much hand in glove, and everyone around the table all the time, and it was so exciting. And you know, originally I had fears. I was like, am I going to feel I'm going to lose authorship? Am I going to get uppity about all this? You know, but I didn't, because they were smart ideas, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say to you, any good idea is welcome. And it was thrilling working with other writers with other perspectives on the material, and you know, they had viewpoints on the characters I didn't have. And the more complex the characters are, the more interesting they are, and the more you want to write them, and the more the audience wants to see them, I believe. So it ended up being a tremendously exciting experience, and I know they're all proud of their work on the show, so that means a lot to me as well, and they wrote great episodes.
I'm glad you mentioned Jose Rivera, because one of the things that we're planning to do at Libros and with this podcast is to have basically writer commentary tracks, the way that we're all so conditioned to expect director commentary tracks, that people can go to our website and listen to the writer's perspective on how a movie came to be. And one of the first ones we wanted to do is to have Mr. Rivera do the Motorcycle Diaries, which is an incredibly popular movie with us in the shop. I guess I should ask you, have you ever been invited to do such a thing? Is it a prospect you would entertain?
I would. I mean, I've been invited to do a lot of DVD commentaries, all of which I've turned down, because I believe the work needs to speak for itself. On the other hand, something about the nuts and bolts of how things come together is always exciting if people are really interested in it. I'm not sure how interested people are, but if they are, you know, I'm always happy to talk about it.
Huh. So is it something you would be readier to do with a work like Penny Dreadful than you would have been on something before?
Probably, yeah, because it's so. I'd be ready to do it in a play in a second, because a play is about, you know, total playwright authorship and sort of laboring away in your dark little room. And, you know, Penny Dreadful is much like that too, until the point of collaboration comes. And then it's all about, you know, what other artists bring to it, which is for me, frankly, the most exciting part. You know, I love writing drafts. You know, why do I get up early in the morning? Because I love my job. I also love engaging with other artists, which is why doing television is so rewarding, because I'm given a chance to do that. It's also what's so rewarding about theater, by the way, because in theater, you know, as you know, you're all in the same room all at the same time, where movies tend to be a little more divided up in terms of who's participating when in the process.
Well, in preparing for this interview, it wasn't just a question of trying to winkle as many advance episodes of Penny Dreadful out of Showtime as I possibly could, but I also wanted to go back at least to some of your work I'd always meant to watch and never caught up with. And that's how I came night before last to be watching a really crappy YouTube dub, captioned in Portuguese, of RKO 281. which I have to tell you overcomes all those disadvantages and then some. And I'd be curious not just to talk about that movie, which for the benefit of anybody listening in is about the battle over Citizen Kane and how Orson Welles triumphed over William Randolph Hearst's efforts to squelch it, but also about where it and the ideas of genius that it propounds, map onto your career. I mean, you're somebody who's written a play about Mark Rothko, and, obviously written that about Orson Welles, and you've written a whole movie called Genius about, Tom Wolfe's relationship with his editor. And
I'm currently writing Michael Jackson. So, yeah, it's very much up my alley.
Which is interesting because, what was it? Is it National Geographic that's doing these series of shows about and called Genius, where they started with, I think, Leonardo, and then they did Picasso, and then now Aretha Franklin. What makes a genius, and is it a label that fits comfortably on everybody from Orson Welles to Michael Jackson?
It does to me. It's a difficult question to answer. Genius, I think, mostly probably has to do with innovation. It's someone seeing something that other people have looked at, but they've never seen it before. When Orson Welles studied movies, and as you know, he made a big study of Stagecoach. Mm-hmm. And John Ford is a great director. There's no question, one of the sort of founders of contemporary or American cinema. But he studied it, and he saw things they hadn't done. And he sat there with Greg Tola and said, why is these two people not in focus at the same time? Can we do that? What if you put the camera down here rather than up there? And they used Stagecoach as a model for all those discussions. So he was looking at a form and seeing something new, which is exactly what Mark Rothko did. He took the forms that were evolving from, the sort of post-impressionists and Matisse, mm-hmm. studied them, studied everything that came before him from Goya and Velázquez, and created something the world had never seen before, and I think that's that's my definition of a genius, someone who says people have not seen this before and maybe they ought.
And is a genius every day, or do they, attain flights of genius in otherwise not quite so?
I think it's a lifetime of preparation for a light to go on. There's a great story when Mike Todd did Around the World in 80 Days. All these celebrities did cameos in it, and Ronald Colman did one day filming in India, mm-hmm. and they got him a Rolls Royce for the day. And someone said to him, why do you get a Rolls Royce for one day? And he said, I don't get the Rolls Royce for one day. I get it for my entire life. And I think that's right. I think, if you look at someone like Michael Jackson, I'm working on now, his entire experience as a human being and as an artist led him to Thriller. He didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to write this album that's going to be the biggest selling album ever, and it's going to change the landscape of popular music and bring African-American music to white kids in the suburbs. His whole life led him to every individual decision he made about every song, the same way Orson Welles' life led him to every shot, or Tom Wolfe's life led him to every line or every word.
And then, of course, there's the case of somebody like Welles, and in a certain way, maybe Howard Hughes and other people you've written about, people who've been a genius, and the genius is not somehow a resource as accessible to them afterward. I guess maybe Michael Jackson falls into that category too, as it's been before. Is that an area of fascination for you?
Well, of course. I mean, how can it not be? I'm a living creator. I'm a living dramatist. And you think about, have I done the best I can do, and will any of it linger on beyond me in any way? Unlike some of those people we're talking about, I live a very sort of subdued life, and I have a quote over my computer, which is from Flaubert, a man who knew how to revolutionize literature, and he wrote, "Be regular and ordinary in your life, like a bourgeois, so that you may be violent and original in your work."
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I live. That's why I go to bed at 8. That's why I get up at 4. And I go to desk and I work like a banker. But I think the temptation for a Thomas Wolfe or an Orson Welles or Howard Hughes is to live as violently as their work. And that probably led to difficulties that they had continuing to do their work with regularity or innovation.
So you worked on, or at least had in your drawer, genius for, I think, at least a dozen years. What's in the drawer now? What do you half suspect may never get made, but it's your fondest secret wish?
Well, I wrote a movie called Night and Day for Michael Mann, which is a genuine noir LA sort of mystery, which it has to do completely with a Hollywood fixer, which is, along with The Aviator, one of my favorite scripts I've ever written, and I just think it's too expensive and big. And also, quite frankly, I'm dealing with 1938 now, so if I never see another fedora, as long as I live, that's okay for the moment. But, I'm working on, I have a play I want to write, so I'm just waiting for the Penny Dreadful Post to be done so I can start working on that. I'm working on a musical, so there's lots of stuff coming up that's really sort of exciting for me. Believe me, if I had things in the drawer, I'd be tossing them out now because Netflix would buy anything at this point. But don't quote me on that.
Well, anything of yours, they'd be fools not to. Just free associating here. Herman Mankowitz is an important character in RKF 281 as the co-author of the script of Citizen Kane. You must know that David Fincher has a whole movie scheduled to come out later this year about Mankowitz with Gary Oldman playing him. Do you know anything about that? What's going on there?
I don't, other than I'm excited to see it. Because like that really. I mean, how could a dramatist not get excited by the Orson Welles, Herman Mankiewicz relationship? It's just a thrilling piece of drama. So I'm delighted. I'm excited to see it.
How do you approach writing about and dramatizing a writer's life, which you've done a couple of times before? It sounds to me like you don't think of your own life as particularly cinematic.
Not remotely.
I think it's safe to say that you at least have never inflicted on a viewer a montage of a wastebasket filling up with crumpled sheets.
No, not yet anyway.
How do you do that? How do you bring that creative process to life in the case of somebody who's not, daubing paint on canvas?
I think I treat the artists as workers, and I treat their artist process. When I was writing Red about Roscoe, it was about, okay, what do you actually do in a studio? What do you do every single day to make art? You don't just paint a canvas and say, well, there's a great art that needs to hang in the Met. You do things. You stretch the canvases. You make the size. You prime the canvas. You mix the paints with powders and with eggs and with, or with it's like, how do you build an airplane? How do you make a beautiful, innovative airplane? You feel the rivets. You look at the blueprints. You actually do the work that's required. So, in any area where I've explored the life of a creator, in any way, I've just tried to deal with the nuts and bolts of what it actually is rather than the theoretical idea of, oh, you're a genius and the muse is going to hand you something, because no one hands you anything. These men and women work incredibly hard, for what they create. And so that to me is interesting to an audience because, I didn't know how a painting really came together, how an abstract expressionist color field painting came together until I researched it and then dramatized it. So I think that's interesting to an audience. I also think it's authentic about how, works of innovation are made.
Does this strike you?
Now, mind you, there's probably many writers, maybe most writers, who disagree with me. Who are like, they do believe in the sort of poetic muse, and that those sudden flashes of inspiration probably do, inspire them to great torrents of creativity. But I'm just more methodical by nature.
If screenwriting had a muse, what would she be like?
I'll have to think about that.
Okay, fair enough. I'll let you off the hook. Well, wow. I do have a couple more questions here.
Of course.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, you mentioned the present moment and how, in fact, that was, at least to some degree, an inciting incident for your creation of Penny Dreadful City of Angels. And in fact, there is a scene early in Penny Dreadful of protest that turns into a race riot, a police riot, call it what you like. How did you approach the writing of that scene, and how do you look back on it this week?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because it's a provocative question, particularly right now. The impetus for City of Angels was entirely the political moment, not in any way, sort of or kind of. It was exactly a response to the world we're living in, where, we saw the rise of, dangerous political demagoguery, foreign influence in our electoral process, the marginalization and demonization of ethnic communities, where things like social engineering, a wall or a highway, become destructive acts. And the question I ask myself is, and what happens to the people who are destroyed because of that? And, LA then and now has had a very fraught political and ethnic climate. 100 years before City of Angels, Los Angeles was Mexico. And the roots of the Mexican culture are deep and frequently ignored because they've been subsumed by other things, by Hollywood and by consumerism and by the beach. But it is who we are, and it is who we were. And so I think it was important to dramatize that. And you can't tell any story of Los Angeles truly that doesn't deal with the Mexican-American experience, and you can't tell the story of a freeway without talking about the communities that were impacted by it. So that was all completely the motivation for writing it. This wasn't a cerebral act. This was a cry of anger and somewhat despair about where we are now, how we got here, and where we might be going. And what's really interesting is you've seen the first, 6 episodes?
Yep.
Well, the last 2 episodes, and I can get you incomplete versions of them.
I will take you up on that.
Are sort of precisely this moment. There's a lynching of a person of color. There's a peaceful protest march that turns into a titanic race riot. And it is so this moment right now that, I wish someone would write an editorial about it. Maybe you, because not to promote the show, but just to say this happened and it's still happening. And how did they address it then? And how are we addressing it now every single moment? It's shocking because people who know the episodes, they're just talking to me constantly about the imagery that we filmed months ago, and now we're seeing in Santa Monica, on Fairfax, and in Brooklyn.
Well, I'm on a different 30s-related hobby horse these days. My last piece for the Times was trying to resurrect the Federal Writers Project, but I hope I get a chance to talk to you again about these things once I have seen the last episode. I mean, I guess it raises the question, when you're writing about something that feels so contemporary, without for a minute asking you how the show comes out, because as a lover of storytelling, I really don't want to know. But how do you approach the ending of something that feels like as much an ongoing state of affairs as current affairs do right now? I mean, how do you decide what you want to leave an audience with, not specifically or in terms of storytelling, but in terms of mood?
I think this show. Not generally. I can only talk about this show right now in relation to what we're saying. You want to leave them with a challenge, which is here's the story we've told up to now, and we're going to keep telling this story. What are you going to do about your life in relation to it? If it's touched you in any way, if it's spoken to you in any way, if you like some of the characters, how are you going to respond to what the United States of America is right now?
I can't wait to see how that comes together as words and images. Can I ask you just one last question, which has, this podcast is still very embryonic and evolving, and if the gods of Zoom hadn't conspired against us, this too would have been a visual interview in which I would have prevailed upon you to do something I mean more and more to get all of our interviewees to do, which is to hold up one book, maybe a book you've owned as long as you've owned any other book, and talk about what it's meant to you, whether it made a reader out of you or it's just, under your skin in a way that, has evolved over the years and never abandoned you. Is there a book like that for you?
Assuredly. It would be Hamlet. It would be my dad's copy of Hamlet that he put in notes in, and because that is a piece of work, it's the poem immortal, as Shakespeare says. I think it is, because I think the character that he created in those circumstances are the most universal, and I've never known a character more complex than Hamlet, and my opinion of him changes constantly. Sometimes I love him, sometimes I have admiration for him, sometimes I hate him, sometimes I think he's a bitch, but there are so many colors. He is painted with every color known to God in that character, and that always inspires me, because like I said before, it's like all you want as a dramatist is to create characters that confuse you and vex you and want you to keep exploring them, especially in television. In a movie or a play, you have your liminal 2 or 2.5 hours, and you have to sort of come to some summation. With ongoing characters, you just want to keep turning them in the light, so the different facets get shined sort of brilliantly in a way that surprise you and hopefully will surprise an audience.
And if Coriolanus had made, $1 billion and people had begged you to turn your hand to adapting Hamlet next, how would you have gone about it?
That's so interesting. I actually had some discussions about this with an actor.
Can you say who?
I cannot.
Okay.
It's an actor I've worked with before and know really well, but it's like the ultimate Gorgon. It's like, do you want to do this? Because you're never going to succeed. Is the failure going to be worthy enough? Because you can only shine a particular light. But yeah, I would probably. I think I've reached the point in my career. I'm like, what have I got to lose at this point? I have the Tony. I own my house. It's like, what are they going to take away?
Would you keep the title, or what would you change it to?
Of course, I keep the title, and I'd keep the language. You have to. That's the trick. That's the game.
Well, it's a game you play incredibly well, and I didn't dare hope that talking to you would be as much fun and as provocative as watching your movies at least once, and in some cases more than once. And I hope in the not too far off future seeing the end of City of Angels, which you call City of Angels, even though it's under the Penny Dreadful banner. Is that how you think
just for brevity.
Gotcha. May I please issue you an invitation to come see Libros Schmibros in Boyle Heights at some point? You will find yourself in a room of thousands upon thousands of books available for free to borrow and one to keep to the entire neighborhood and all Angelinos beyond. And I think you'd find a home there.
Indeed, I would.
Okay, then.
All right, excellent. Well, watch the rest of the episodes. I'll get them to you. Then let me know what you think. And if you feel inspired that you want to write about it, fine with me.
I will take you up on that, sir. Thank you, Mr. Logan. Right. Thanks on behalf of everybody. I so appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So ends another episode of Libros Schmibros, recorded at the bilingual nonprofit Libros Schmibros Lending Library in Boyle Heights. By all means, follow us online in all the old familiar places, or email us via info@libroschmibros.org. By the way, we couldn't do this podcast without the whole Libros team, Cuauhtemoc, Colleen, Diana, and Alberto. And all of them would kill me if I didn't add this. Please consider visiting libroschmibros.org, hitting the donut button, the donate button, and giving us a gift. We put good free books into people's hands 5 days a week here at Libros, right across from Mariachi Plaza, up in the old Boyle Hotel. I'm David Kipen, and there'll always be a free book for you, and thousands more to borrow here at Libros Schmibros.